and we look to the week ahead. Let's kick off with week in review thoughts on all things that happened in Washington. Let's go to Washington with Bill Spindle, climate and energy editor at Semafor. Bill, as I like to call Washington, Rome in the sense of the empire, but the world gathered in Washington last week, all of the big central bank governors and finance ministers and so forth. You'd have to say the tone was gloomy. What was your takeaway from all the noise in Washington last week?
Yeah. Hey, Sean, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Absolutely. The mood continues to grow gloomier by the day, with inflation continuing pretty strongly here. It seems likely the Fed is going to continue to raise rates quite aggressively, and they really made clear they're going to do that until inflation comes down, and that's going to be a big push because so much of it is really supply side. They're really going to in the end have to bring demand down a lot to try to begin to make progress on inflation, but that seems to be the task they've set out for themselves. Meanwhile, problems in China with COVID zero and with the housing market, just overall the situation around the world just seems pretty, as you say, gloomy.
Let's go to Beirut, where all things are bright and wonderful. Lori Hitayan, MENA Director at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. The other big headline last week, Lori, one can't ignore the sort of war of words again between Washington and Riyadh. The sort of continuous fallout from Saudi Arabia's decision, OPEC Plus's decision to proceed with a sizable OPEC quota cut 1 month ahead of a US election. Your thoughts on the fallout and the continuing war of words there?
Well, we are going to wait for what the President Biden said. There will be consequences. Let's see what are these consequences that will be. But I do think that part of it is political, part of it is economic. So, and this will continue. Definitely, I wouldn't say that. I know that many think that OPEC plus decisions are, or this is what they portray is pure pure economic fundamentals taken into consideration. But I think people, like some governments in OPEC plus, wouldn't mind, like if you want, a defeat of the Biden administration in the midterm. And if this decision helps, yes, they would do it. But I think at the same time, we're all hearing about a recession, inflation, all of that, and all the numbers that are coming from IMF, etc., saying that there will be a slowdown in economy next year. So that is, the next year is like in 2 months. It's not like next year like one year. So there is as well like economic consideration from the OPEC plus for that decision. At the same time, there is that politics. If the Americans can gather troops around this oil cap, price cap, and that is another cartel, so that the real cartel can play its role as well of controlling the prices as well of the production, etc. So I think these are like different levels of political competition and economic competition.
James McCallum, CEO and Chairman of Exergy Group and Professor of Energy at Strathclyde University, sitting in Dublin in Europe. James, big story, I would suppose, also last week, you would have to say, is the fact that the oil price fell quite significantly through the week, despite the OPEC Plus decision, despite the escalation of war in Ukraine. Your thoughts on where the energy markets are at, given that backdrop?
Oh, well, clearly the oil price market's responding to the gloomy sentiment that Bill was reflecting on just a second ago. I think the last week's event, the cut in production from OPEC Plus, was the second of probably what the key themes here in Europe, and certainly around the United Kingdom, of mistimed cuts, I suppose, would be the operative thought that I would have. Whether it's a mistimed cut in taxation rates, if you're the Chancellor of the UK or the Prime Minister of the UK, or a mistimed large 2 million barrels a day cut by OPEC plus. I think sentiment wasn't taken into account in either of those two things. And when you take a look at sentiment, neither OPEC Plus nor indeed the Chancellor in the UK have come out the back end of it looking rosy. So I think for me, the growing trend continues to be that there are demand worries. So even if you cut by 2 million, as all your speakers of last week have accurately reflected, really 1 million cut in real terms, it's not impacting the level of negative sentiment around demand. And so the oil price briefly bounced up and then started its negative trend again.
Bill, just picking up on that point vis-a-vis the dynamics with Saudi Arabia and the Washington, with the most notably, it seems quite personal on some level between the US president and the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. We were trying to take a pulse last week whether it was a storm in a teacup, or is there something more significant in the fracture in this relationship? What's your perspective, and what does it look like from Washington?
Yeah, I think this is part of a recalibration that the Saudi-US relationship has been going through for some time and probably will continue to go through. It's in that sense, I think it is a serious diplomatic rift going forward. I think the Saudis and OPEC want to approach this as just purely an economic decision, and in some level, you can see how it is that, given the way demand is likely going to fall off. But the U.S. point here is that we've got a war going on in Ukraine. We've got an invasion of another country, and this is not business as usual. And in fact, in a way, the U.S. was looking for a political decision, just one that went their way. And it didn't. And, that is a real shift. The Saudis like to put it as, well, we don't take orders anymore. Okay, true. But then we're in the midst of a longer, slower recalibration. It's not going to shatter the relationship. It's not going to radically change it. But it's definitely a part of a recalibration that's going on.
And Bill,
almost certainly will continue.
Just to follow up on that, Bill, is this a party thing? Party in terms of the US, is this a Democrat thing, or is it a Democrat and Republican? They share common ground on this relationship.
I think there's some bipartisan support behind it, and has been for a long time. That's not a big change. Clearly, the Democrats, or at least some factions among them, really do take this somewhat personally, especially after they feel Biden went out of his way to sort of bring MBS and the Saudi relationship fully back onto a level plane, and expected it to change somewhat. But yeah, I think it's like I say, a recalibration going forward.
Laurie, your thoughts on that? I mean, ultimately, there's two things here coexisting in this decision by OPEC Plus. One is the market dynamics, and you might say that given where prices have come off in the last week, and even the IEA themselves reported last week that the outlook for demand growth was declining, and yet the optics really of this decision by OPEC Plus, the timing is really the problem here. And we also had last week the UAE president going to Moscow, and it seems, according to reporting, that the UAE were reluctant participants in the OPEC Plus cut. Where do you think this analysis on this sort of triumvirate of relationships here, UAE, Saudi, Russia?
Well, from the beginning, that for a long time ago, since this OPEC Plus existed, we knew that because OPEC on its own couldn't have a control of the market. But with OPEC Plus, they made the change and they had an influence. So they don't want to break that OPEC Plus because of what's happening today. And that was clear from day one. And they will continue with OPEC Plus, and they will try to manage all the risks that come from the US. And I don't think that the EU is in a position to oppose what the OPEC, Saudi or the UAE is doing, because they're looking for all the places possible to get gas and oil, etc. So they're not. So basically, we're back to this issue between the US and the Saudis and the UAE. It's like, for like before this war, like the UAE was trying to play the foreign ministry of the Gulf countries. So basically, they're going to say that we are open to everyone, and we think of business and economy and what is better. And definitely, at one point, there will be need. You would need people to broker peace or talks, etc. So, and I think the UAE is positioning itself in that place where they can play that role. And definitely, they don't want to let Turkey play that role in the region, so that there is another sensitivity there. So I think it is about, like, yes, we are in good terms with the US. Yes, we can provide whatever energy is needed in Europe. You remember the French were talking to the UAE, and then we can talk to the Russians. So the UAE, if you see it, that they can play that role next about, like, okay, let's come and sit and discuss these things, because we cannot continue having this war. It is affecting the whole global economy. So in that sense, that's it, I guess. And I think for the Americans, definitely at one point, they would need someone that that could play the role of the facilitator or someone that will mediate between all of these countries. So at least for now, this is how I'm reading it. But let's wait and see how these things will develop.
James, we had both our own Gulf Intelligence Forum in Fujairah last week before, and the Energy Intelligence Forum in London, and the forecasting on oil price from all of the sort of energy industry, energy markets stakeholders was that prices would remain firmly in in the 80 to 100 framework through the end of the year, but yet we've had this slide. I mean, does demand destruction, do you think, now trump any supply concerns? It's in the driving seat. What are your thoughts on the balance between those two things going forward?
Well, I think demand destruction at the moment certainly is in the driving seat, and when one reflects upon many of the conversations that we've had over the past months, the one thing that you would have to say around the OPEC Plus decision is that, again, they would appear to have got the maths reasonably correct. I mean, most of the speakers, most of the listeners to the podcast would support the fact that the OPEC Plus members would seek to defend a price of around 90. We've had that over and over again over the course of the weeks. And if you take a look at this week, they would appear to have got the maths right. I think the bit that caused the greatest amount of upset was the fact that there was a sudden late shift in the magnitude of the cut. The advance positioning of the cut was probably going to be about 1 million, and then suddenly at the very last minute it shifted to 2. And I do wonder whether or not that was the element of the discontent that the UAE were putting into the room, which was, look, we've kind of advanced sold a cut, everybody's expecting a cut, but let's not go with a cut of this magnitude. I think that was probably where it was. And I think when you reflect on that and look at that, you go, well, what would have driven that sudden doubling? Even if the maths was correct, we had a G20 finance ministers meeting in Washington. It was bound to generate a reaction. We've got, as you say, the IEA forecast, et cetera, coming out. So I think it was at best mistimed. I think it was clearly a key message that they will do everything that they need to do to defend that $90 price point. I just think they should have moved slower towards that. As you spoke about at the tail end of last week, the meeting schedules are now being adjusted to be, every 2 months and every 6 months for the ministers. So clearly, that also leaves something out there that changing back would be a little bit more difficult, or responding more quickly will be more difficult going forward in the future. So it was a real line in the sand. I think demand will ride us through into the first quarter as the prevailing measure of concern. Very little going into supply, whether that's in the United States or indeed in the OPEC countries. Very, very few investments being made by the majors into the service sector. And you can see that from the OSX index, which I regularly quote, down 4% on Friday.
Yeah,
Bill,
Sean, I was just going to jump in there real quick and just say, I really agree with that with James. It's that last minute change. And I think that's what really gave the coloring to the whole situation, because you basically had a situation where everyone knew what Russia wanted and Putin wanted. Everybody knew what Biden and the U.S. wanted, and in that context, suddenly a decision was clearly made on one side as opposed to another, and it just looked very stark.
The other thing that was quite stark last week, Bill, which I wanted just to follow up on, and I'm trying to understand the measurement of how I didn't even include it in my daily digest today. So maybe I'm off, but Donald Trump being subpoenaed to come in front of the January 6th committee, sitting in the US, sitting in Washington, inside the bubble there. Does this feel like this is a big story? Is this a fracture of scale that one should be paying attention to in America at the moment? Or is it just more sort of Trump noise?
Well, there's a lot of Trump noise in there, I think, for sure. I think this is going to continue to push Donald Trump to be a pretty significant factor in the midterm elections, which, probably benefits the Democrats to some extent on a broad basis. If he's in there as a the likelihood he'll ever appear because that subpoena is next to zero, I'd say. But it certainly keeps him out there front and center, and that will play a role in the shifting flux that is the elections we're coming into now. Just weeks away.
Still a wedge issue. I also think sometimes that I'm concerned that the media, the US media, is falling into the same trap again of giving Trump billions of dollars worth of free coverage, which, as the saying goes, all publicity is good, is good. But Laurie, the other, not so big story last week, probably in any other week of any other year, may have been a headline story on the front page of the New York Times, and that was Israel and Lebanon agreeing on anything. Never mind who founded the shawarma, but actually a maritime border was agreed. Your thoughts on that? Exactly what was agreed, and how significant do you think it is?
Well, in Beirut, they feel that economically it's very significant, and in Israel, they feel that is a very important political and economic even deal. So basically, both countries were finally managed after 10 years in agreeing on their maritime borders and finally identifying their EEZs clearly without any overlaps. And this was mediated by the Americans. So the US is very happy to be able, after 10 years, to solve this issue. So basically, automatically for Lebanon, this means that now they can unlock again the potential, the oil and gas potential, especially in one of the blocks where there were disputes. And this is Block 9, where already Total, the French company, and the Eni, the Italian company, have concessions or have the contract. So, and the deal exactly says that immediately after the deal comes into effect, Total will relaunch its activities. And this is what everybody is waiting today. They're waiting for Total to relaunch its activities in Block 9, and especially on this prospect that was part of the deal, which Lebanon calls it Qana. So there is a prospect for gas, and now the mission is for Total to find it. At the same time, immediately after the deal, we've heard the Minister of Energy saying that Qatar Energy is interested today to enter into the consortium with Total and Eni. And let's see if they will only replace the 20% of Novatek, or they would want to acquire more shares in that consortium and maybe play more of a role than just a non-operator supporting the operator. So basically for Lebanon, they feel that this will unlock potentials. For the Israelis on the other side, they feel that now that the security issue is solved, because like this dispute was creating some escalation, some security threat, etc. So that now companies would be more interested in coming and investing in finding more gas in Israel, and therefore Israel being able to fulfill the MOU that was signed between the EU, Israel, and Egypt on sending gas to the European Union and being part of the diversification portfolio for the EU. So this is what they're wishing for, because already Israel has production, as you know, is producing, but already has contracts and signed contracts. Let's see how much they will be able to sell the LNG on spot market, or they will be able to really dedicate part of their already existing production to the EU market. But definitely they are looking for a fourth bidding round that was postponed. So I think maybe they will launch it soon, so that they would be able to attract companies and work fast to be able to fulfill the needs of the Europeans, not now, but maybe in a couple of years. And Lebanon is hoping to find gas for internal use, but at the same time, the hype is in Lebanon that yes, we will be part of this diversification portfolio of the EU, even though we don't have any discoveries yet. And from discovery to FID to production, everybody knows like how complicated it is, and there are many variables that could make it either go from 5 years to maybe indefinite. So all of that, but definitely there is a very there is a positive sentiment in Lebanon, but taking into account as well that this is a failing state, so governance matters. If they fail on governance, no one will see the benefits of oil and gas.
Yeah, and nobody will fund it probably. Let's go to the survey question, because I want to look a little bit week forward now, James. Clearly today was the start of the Chinese Communist Party Congress in Beijing. From pretty strong words from President Xi Jinping, who is up for re-election, whatever that means in China. Ultimately, he's getting himself a third term. Will this be bullish or bearish for oil markets going forward? Bullish in the sense that now perhaps China can finally lift the COVID because Xi has got his third term, or bearish because no, he won't do that. He'll keep on with COVID because to do anything different would sort of be embarrassing, or will it be no different? So I'm just thinking a little bit sort of unipolar in terms of what it means for the oil markets. But James, more widely, this political congress in China, obviously, as the President Xi has declared today himself, that China is now, the quote is, China's international influence, appeal, and power to shape the world has significantly increased. That was his kind of opening declaration. Your thoughts of how important this Congress party is, how important or significant Xi's continuation as president will be?
Look, it's an unprecedented third term, but I think it continues on a path of relative stability in China. So I think that's a good thing. I mean, everybody's anticipating that he will get that third term, and I don't think there's anybody that doesn't think he won't get that. I think the question that you pose around whether or not the Congress will mark a line in the sand as regards being able to relax their hardline COVID policy is a really interesting one. I think we're all hoping that it does, and certainly, you know, there's much talk around what China is going to do to re-inject some form of stimulus in terms of growth into the country, and clearly a relaxation of COVID policy from what we've seen around the rest of the world would have such an effect, rather than looking at sort of like changing sort of like debt burdens on companies, which I think they will also seek to do, or putting stimulus into infrastructure-led projects. Clearly, the other thing to remember is that this happens once every 5 years. So it will very much be a sort of a setting of the firmness of the foundation for what's to come. I think my personal hope is obviously that we see a relaxation in COVID policy in China. I don't think it will happen immediately in the short term, but I think we'll start to see more international delegations from the politicians once the Congress is behind us, and that will be the flag for change. The negative to that is, as one of your press articles records, is that the national press in China for 3 days straight have been recording that the rigid COVID policy is a very, very good thing, and you'd have to think that that's coming as a political message from Congress. So what I hear is no short-term change or immediate change, but I personally think we will see a relaxation of COVID policy as a part of a growth stimulus within China going forward.
Bill, I wanted to get your views. I was a long time India watcher. Obviously, you've just spent many months in India, just returned from a big reporting trip there. You were the Southeast Asian correspondent for the Wall Street Journal for many years. How does India look at President Xi being sort of coronated for, president for life? What does that look like, you think, from New Delhi?
I think they see it as it's unchanged. Things are not going to change. Things are not good between India and China, needless to say, and are going to continue to be very rocky. But I think they feel that it's a continuation in some stability, and that's probably better for them than the kind of change that might, make them rethink the whole approach or something like that. So I just think it doesn't change a lot for how they approach things.
Does it compel, I mean, we haven't seen it too much recently, but does it in any way compel India or America from either side to find a way to be more aligned? We've seen sort of gaps emerge between India and the US in recent times, particularly under the leadership of Modi. Does this help bring America and India back closer together? Your thoughts on that?
I think it doesn't change much, but I think what that means is you're going to continue with the situation where, yes, you get some disagreements, some spats on the surface, but really beneath the surface, India and the US are really moving quite slowly but surely to a much wider and broader relationship, including the defense, very much including the defense relationship over time. And I think that that will only continue with the current leadership in China, and with Russia and Putin's fortunes continuing to sort of wane. I think you're just going to see that relationship between India and the US grow more. But again, beneath the surface, India will always have its independence streak, and they put a lot of weight and a lot of stock in that, and that will continue too. But really, is in terms of their broader security concerns, economic concerns, they are firmly in the U.S. camp, although they certainly would not like to hear it depicted that way.
Laurie, again, from a Middle East perspective, obviously China has become a very big actor in the region, and President Xi, I think, is absolutely right. China is now a major global player as compared to 5 years ago when he was starting his second term, and certainly 10 years ago when he was starting his first term. And one of the big developments over that period has been the engagement of China into the Middle East, the Belt Road Initiative, which is connects all the way through Central Asia and into Pakistan and the Middle East. Your thoughts from a Middle East perspective, what this sort of coronation of Xi into a lifetime position?
I think, like, for the, as you said, for the Middle East, it was very important. It's always economic and nothing more than that. So and if they can benefit from that economic presence of China, definitely they I don't think like this is a big deal in the region, like the change of leadership or not. Like, they see China as important economic partner, and as long as the economic strategy for the Middle East doesn't change, I don't think like there is this preference of who leads what, I guess. So I don't know much about that, but this is like at least my impression of it. It's not that big deal. It's not like when it makes a difference if it's a Democrat or Republican in the US, and it will have implications in the region. It's like China is China with a strategy that is the economic strategy that it has, and this is how they deal with it, regardless of who leads the country.
Let's get the survey result and give James the last word here this morning. The survey, which we'll put out on social now, kind of no different, bullish. James, I think looking at, again, just sort of finishing up with the China piece, but also it intersects with the Russia piece and the European piece, that we've seen Russia, just the Putin in the last day or two, sort of pulling back a little bit after a week of very severe bombardment. He seems to be indicating that he's going to also back away from the conscription. And I'm wondering from that where China's discomfort with escalating that vicious kind of, as he said, he doesn't want to destroy Ukraine. Where do you see the interconnections there between Europe, China, and Russia?
What a huge question.
I know it is. I mean, it does. Well, whether China can keep, let's keep it very simple on the Ukraine war, whether China can keep or wants to keep Russia a little bit under control in how severe its destruction of Ukraine and destabilizing of Europe it challenges to be?
Yeah, look, I think the prevailing conversation that is coming to the fore now for everybody is one of global recession. That's the dominant conversation, and whether or not a big cut like 2 million barrels a day from OPEC Plus would tip the world into global recession, whether continued escalation of the situation in Russia will tip the world into global recession, whether a lack of reaction within China over the property challenges will tip the world into global recession. Clearly, I think what's going on in the background is there is a desire for, if you like, by world leaders to try and sort of find a leveling out in terms of the global circumstance. In China, I think, that's what we're seeing into Russia, leading the message to Putin, pull back, de-escalate. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in a situation where it is extraordinarily difficult, perhaps even impossible, for Putin to withdraw entirely, as it is for Europe to pull back from their sanctions. And so that's going to continue. But I think it's hopefully going to be ramped down. The one thing I will say, when you take a look at the G20, there was just this backdrop of a sentiment there, which I recognize is slightly counter to what Bill was saying earlier on, where there is a message, similar message to the Fed that says, look, this incredibly hawkish approach that you're taking to inflation rates. Yeah, hey, listen, let's take a look at October data. Let's pull back a little bit from that. Let's soften that hard line. And I think that's the consistency across the piece, Sean. Is as we come into the winter, there are lots of moving parts. I think global leaders are just saying, look, let's stop, pause, let's calm things down a little bit here and do everything we can to stop that tipping into a global recession. And that's what I think we'll see play out in the fourth quarter.
If we're not already in one. I mean, my just closing thought about the European China thing is that really that's probably the big question mark coming into a Xi's third time in office. Is it's clear where the US and China have put their red lines, and there is obviously a breakdown of that relationship, and China and Russia clearly are in a bit of a bear hug. What seems unclear to me and where it goes is, where does China and Europe go? What is the future of that dance? As China has such massive influence in Africa, where there's literally hundreds of millions of potential migrants floating across the Mediterranean. How can Europe manage its China relationship? I think is really a big question mark going forward into the sort of mid to long term over the next term of President Xi. For the immediate week ahead, I think we have to see what stops the oil price falling. Maybe just all of those people leaving Washington and keeping their mouths shut and don't mention the word recession for 24 hours, and maybe that will help put a floor under the oil price, because it does seem, and it has been that way for some weeks now, it just seems to want to fall when all else is said and done. The price sort of retreats back to a downward momentum, and will 90 indeed be a floor, as James indicated? Will OPEC Plus, have they succeeded in making 90 a floor with their recent action? We'll have to see. Bill Spindle, thank you so much for staying up so late in Washington. James McCallum for being up so early in Dublin, and Laurie for having a leisurely Sunday morning with a nice coffee and a Manish Lebner or something very pleasant like that. We all wish we were in Beirut this Sunday morning. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning to you all. Bye-bye.